Story 1.
The Linwood Hall Mansion. The profession of a real estate appraiser teaches one to see the truth behind appearances. It teaches you to ignore the fresh paint that hides the dampness, to hear the subtle creak that betrays a compromised foundation. For 40 years, Arthur Crane was the man who determined the value of things. He translated stories into numbers, decay into liabilities. But nothing in his career prepared him for the final assignment, the appraisal that forced him into retirement. Linwood Hall. The following story is not in his final report. It is the confession he has kept for far too long. It all began with an anonymous client and an irresistible offer. The instruction was simple. Spend 24 hours on the property, cataloging each of its 110 rooms. The payment was exorbitant. With a peculiar clause, he was to ignore what the client called the acoustic idiosyncrasies of the premises. The real work began after the sun went down. He was in the grand ballroom, the echo of his own breath, his only company, when he heard it for the first time. A shuffling of feet on the floor above, slow, methodical, as if an elderly butler were still making his nightly rounds. Arthur's initial reaction was professional skepticism. He stopped, lifting his head to the vaulted darkness of the ceiling, and waited. The sound did not repeat. Old houses settle, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the hall. The structure of a mansion this age was like the body of a sleeping giant, always shifting, always groaning. He noted on his clipboard normal structural noises due to age and foundation settlement. It was a logical, professional explanation. But deep down, he knew that sound hadn't been a creak. It had been a footstep. That sound should have been impossible. The entrances were sealed, and Arthur was the only living being for miles. His work depended on logic, on reason. Every unrecorded anomaly was a stain on his reputation. But what was at stake that night was much more than his career. It was his sanity. The air in the mansion was heavy, thick with the smell of dust, mold, and something else, ... A faint floral scent, like a bouquet of lilies, left to rot a century ago. He felt a cold that didn't come from the broken windows, but emanated from the walls themselves. A cold that seemed to suck the warmth from his body and the courage from his soul. The loneliness within those walls was a tangible force. As he walked the cavernous corridors, Arthur felt the weight of the Widener family's history. A dynasty marked as much by staggering success as by profound tragedy. He wasn't just appraising a building. He was treading on the ashes of entire lives. This was meant to be his final appraisal before a peaceful retirement, the crowning achievement of a flawless career. Instead, he felt like an intruder in a mausoleum, and the growing sense that he was not alone was turning the job into a test of psychological endurance. He had to continue, room by room. His methodical nature was the only thing keeping him sane. Arthur was on the second floor, in the hallway of the family wing. The bedroom doors stood open like silent mouths screaming forgotten stories. It was then that he saw it at the far end of the hall. The nursery door closed, not with a slam, but with a soft, deliberate click, as if a careful hand had pulled it shut. His heart hammered. "Draft," he said aloud, his voice cracking. He walked slowly toward the door, his flashlight trembling. He pressed his ear against the cold wood and listened. It wasn't the wind, it was a melody. The unmistakable, faint, and dissonant melody of a music box playing from the other side. His hand shook as he turned the icy brass doorknob. The door opened with a long, protesting groan, revealing a scene of absolute devastation. The wallpaper, printed with faded angels and clouds, hung in damp strips. A dark wood crib had collapsed under its own weight, and the toys scattered on the floor were covered in a thick, gray, untouched layer of dust. There was no music box in sight. The exact instant his flashlight beam swept the room, the melody stopped, cut off mid-note, plunging the room into a deep, accusatory silence. This defied all explanation. The house was not empty. The epicenter of the cold and fear was the patriarch's study on the ground floor. The room was a sanctuary of power and darkness, with oak-paneled walls and a fireplace large enough to swallow a man. An oil portrait of the home's founder, the industrialist Pab Whittier, hung above the mantel, his painted eyes seeming to judge him. It was there that the presence became undeniable. The door behind him slammed shut with the force of an explosion, making the floor tremble. The temperature dropped so abruptly, his breath turned to fog. The smell of a freshly lit cigar filled the air, suffocating. And then, a voice. It didn't come from a specific point, but from everywhere at once. A deep, guttural whisper, full of arrogance and rage, that spoke a single word: mine. In that moment, in the reflection of the glass protecting the portrait, he did not see only himself. He saw dozens of other figures behind him. Women in ball gowns with expressions frozen in dread. Servants in their uniforms, motionless as statues, and frightened children clinging to one another. A dozen trapped souls, all staring at him with silent terror. They were not the ghosts, they were the audience. The air in the room grew heavy, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The objects on the oak desk began to vibrate, and a low growl seemed to emanate from the very walls, the sound of a predator defending its territory. The true horror was the owner of the voice, the master of that house, who refused to give up his property or its inhabitants. Panic broke his paralysis. He abandoned his equipment, his clipboard, his dignity. He ran towards the locked door and threw himself against it with all the strength he had. The old wood splintered and gave way. He didn't stop running, charging through the dark halls, knocking over dust-covered furniture, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the filthy windows. When he finally burst out into the cold night air, he did not look back. He knew that if he did, he would see them all in the windows, watching him leave. He reached his car, caked in mud, his body trembling, covered in a century's worth of dust and cold sweat. His hands could barely turn the key in the ignition. The next day, his hands still shaking, he typed his final report, citing insurmountable structural risks and black mold contamination. He declared the property uninhabitable and worthless. He ended his career that morning. The experience hadn't just scared him. It had shattered the logical foundation upon which he had built his entire life. The truth is, Linnywood Hall has an incalculable value, but it cannot be sold. A property can only be sold when the owner decides to leave, and the owner of Linnywood Hall never left. Some foundations are not made of stone, but of souls who refuse to be evicted. And have you ever been in a place where you felt the walls had a memory and a pulse? Share your story in the comments. Stay sharp, everyone. To all our amazing viewers and loyal subscribers, we know many of you watch our videos, but haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these stories and want to support this project, please hit subscribe, give the video a like, and share it. Now, enjoy what's coming up.
Story 2.
The home of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. In a contractor's line of work, you learn that every old house has its ghosts. Not the chain-rattling kind, but the ghosts of faulty wiring, noisy plumbing, and foundations that settle in the night. David was a contractor who specialized in restoring the architectural gems of Los Angeles. He was the man who brought classic Hollywood homes into the 21st century. He dealt with facts, blueprints, and materials, not legends. At least, that's what he thought before he accepted the contract to renovate the house at 1822 Prop Street, the famous former residence of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. The project was a contractor's dream, a generous budget to modernize an iconic home while preserving its classic charm. The first week, everything went normally. Demolition began, and the sounds of renovation filled the halls that were once a television set. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. Tools left in one room would appear in another the next morning. He and his crew blamed each other, laughing it off. But then, The light in the master bedroom, a room where they had already shut off the circuit breaker for safety, turned on by itself. In the middle of the afternoon, bathing the dusty hallway in a warm, inexplicable glow. Immediately, David went to the breaker box in the basement, expecting to find the circuit flipped back on, and it was. He attributed it to a dangerous electrical fault, reprimanded the crew about safety protocols, and reinforced the lock on the breaker. But no one admitted to having been in the basement. From that day on, the atmosphere changed. The house seemed to have a consciousness, a weight in the air that was denser in the rooms that served as the main set for the adventures of Ozzy and Harriet. It was a constant, quiet feeling of being watched, as if the owner of the shadows. Professionally, the stakes were enormous. This was the biggest contract of David's career. The new owner, an impatient film producer, demanded perfection and punctuality. Any significant delay, any unexplainable problem, could not only cost him the job, but also tarnish his reputation in a town where news, good or bad, travels fast. At first, his concern was solely for the schedule and the budget. Every creaking door was a potential cost. Every flickering light, a wiring problem to be solved. But soon, the stakes became personal. Two of his best men asked to be transferred to another project, muttering about feeling cold hands on their shoulders and hearing whispers when they were alone. Their fear was contagious. David found himself fighting not just a deadline, but an unseen force that seemed to actively resist every wall they tore down, every fresh coat of paint they applied. The house wasn't just a project, it was becoming an adversary. And for the first time in his life, his skepticism, the most reliable tool in his arsenal, was beginning to fail. The activity escalated from electrical anomalies to something far more direct. David was working late one night, alone, reviewing blueprints in the family's old living room. The silence of the empty house was absolute until it wasn't. He heard footsteps on the floor above, slow, calm, moving from the master bedroom toward the top of the staircase. His blood ran cold when he realized the rhythm and path of the footsteps were the exact same ones Ozzy Nelson took in the opening of his television show every week. The sound stopped at the top of the stairs, and then the master bedroom door slammed shut with a force that echoed throughout the house. He dropped the blueprints and grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning like a warning. The master bedroom door, which they had propped open for easy access, was indeed closed. As his hand neared the cold knob, he froze. A sound was coming from within. It wasn't a whisper, not a footstep. It was a faint, melodic whistling, the kind of sound you'd hear from a vintage radio. Someone was whistling the theme song to the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Logic could no longer explain this. Determined to break the hold that the house was exerting over him and his project, David made a foolish decision. He would work through the night alone to finish prepping the master bedroom, the epicenter of it all. If he could conquer that room, he could conquer the house. Around 2 in the morning, as he was applying plaster to a wall, the air in the room turned frigid, a winter-like cold that made him shiver. The powerful work lights he had set up flickered erratically, and one by one went out, plunging him into darkness, save for the lone beam of his headlamp. It was then that he heard it, right behind him. So close, he felt the air move. A calm sigh. A sigh of disappointment. He spun around in an instant, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the darkness, and he was there. Standing by the window, looking out at the garden that had once been his, was the translucent silhouette of a man. He was wearing a cardigan, and the shape of a pipe was visible in his hand. There was no doubt. It was Ozzie. He turned his head slowly in David's direction, his face expressing not anger, but a deep sadness, a territorial melancholy. In that moment, the bedroom door slammed shut and locked. The lights throughout the house began flashing frantically, and the whistling of the theme song erupted from everywhere at once, filling the house with a deafening sound. It was not a violent attack. It was a calm and absolute declaration of ownership. As suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The whistling ceased. The lights went out. The figure vanished. David stood paralyzed in the silence and darkness for a moment that felt like an eternity. The fear gave way to a resigned understanding. He took a hammer from his belt, walked to the window, and shattered it. He climbed out onto the first-floor roof and down to the ground, not looking back, leaving behind thousands of dollars in equipment and his professional pride. The next morning, he called the client and canceled the contract, fabricating a story about severe structural problems. David never again took a renovation job in a house with history. He told his crew the foundation was compromised, which, in a way, was true. The renovation project for the old Nelson house was abandoned, and as far as anyone knows, no one else has tried to significantly alter it. The house is still there, a monument to a bygone television era. But inside, it seems the owner doesn't approve of changes. Ozzie Nelson is still home, and the show, in a very real way, never ended. Some homes hold on to their owners more tightly than we can imagine. And you, have you ever worked or lived in a place that seemed to resist any change, as if the structure itself had a will of its own? Share your story in the comments.